I will introduce the panelists briefly. We'll say a little bit about the format or the idea behind it. The panelists will give a statement, then we will have a discussion. And at the end of this, we will have 15 minutes for questions and answers from the audience. So my guests today are Sunita Reddy. She's here. She is Associate Professor at the Center of Social Medicine and Community, the Health School of Social Sciences at the JNU in Delhi. She has worked on medical tourism, on maternal and child health and reproductive health, on migrant women domestic workers in Delhi, but also on topics like surrogacy, gender violence, and topics at the interface of public anthropology, public health, medical anthropology, and anthropology. She is also a member in different non-governmental organizations, and she works for and in the social service. She's an honorary president of an NGO called DAAD, which provides vocational training to women and youth. And she is founder, member, and chairperson of the Anthropos India Foundation, which is into methods and philosophy in carrying out applied and action research in the social sciences. Thank you, Sunita, for joining us here today from Delhi. Our second panelist is Dilip Menon, who is Mellon Chair of Indian Studies and the Director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He also works as a translator from Malayalam, and he writes widely on film, on theater and literature. But his bulk of research has engaged with issues on caste, on socialism, on equality and inequality in modern India, which has resulted in a number of essays and a monograph on issues of caste in modern India. He also has translated novels which were written in Indian languages by lower caste individuals. So thank you, Dilip, also for being here today. And my third guest is Fernando Resende, who is a senior lecturer and research coordinator at the Department of Media and Cultural Studies at the Universidade Federal Fluminense, short UF, in Brazil. He works at the interface of critical cultural studies, somewhere between media studies and literary studies, but also with a small leg, with one leg in anthropology. And he is the founder of the newly founded Center for Global South Studies and Research called Travizia. And he has, apart from his academic achievements, he has programmed films for the Egyptian Contemporary Documentary Showcase at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro, and organized colloquiums related to critical cultural studies and communication in Brazil and in the UK, especially at SOAS. My name is Gabi Alex. I've been working in the fields of medical anthropology, anthropology of children and childhood, and over the last year on oral traditions. And I'm located at the University of Tübingen. So we are here together because we cooked this up as a format where we have time to think through our different respective disciplinary lenses, but also from our different subject positions, our different ways of being embedded in the world, in the society, in our neighborhoods, in our families. In this moment where the COVID-19 pandemic is taking hold of all of us. And we would like to stimulate a discussion which is not based on papers purely or on presentations, but the format will be that each of us gives a brief statement, me a little bit shorter, mostly the panelists, and then I will ask questions which relate to the little text that we put in front of our panel, and we will then discuss these issues. And I'm very glad we can do this, and I hope we find a format that is relaxed, which is not so easy when you are online. But we will. I think it will get easier by the time. And I would like to start with the short talks from the panel members, and the first person is Sunita.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gabriel. It's a pleasure to be on this platform on Global South, and especially this summer school, where we were planning to come over to Germany, but as all of you know, the situation is that all of us are stuck in our own homes and country, and there's no movement around. So we are passing through a very difficult phase of this pandemic. Across the world, almost all the nations have been affected. And taking this opportunity to just highlight few issues which we in India are facing. Since this format is a little informal, I won't be quoting any studies, I won't be reviewing any literature or the data, but it will be a first-hand reflections of what is happening all around, and giving first of all, a brief background of the country, which will put the whole situation in a context. So let me very briefly give a background of the country for the larger audiences to understand the context of India and how we are reeling through this pandemic. And then I would like to raise few issues related to social and cultural and also public health aspects. And finally, what is the way forward and what our country at the moment is planning in future. So let me start by saying that India is the second most populous country, as all of you know, almost with 1.3 billion population, and roughly around 35 to 40% urban and almost 70% rural population. However, there's been a lot of migration from rural to urban, which has been increasing over the years. And India being the most multi-ethnic, multicultural, most diverse country in the world, and that also further poses challenges in the governance. I would like to also talk about India having one of the emerging economies with wide social and economic disparities, complexities in terms of adversaries, hierarchies on the axis of caste, class, gender, ethnicity, and religion. Poverty levels are high. Up to 24% of world's poor live in India, according to World Bank 2017 report. Health expenditure, however, is lowest with 1.02% of GDP, though having a robust public healthcare service systems within India, which is mostly overburdened and lacking essential medicines and even PPEs in today's context, owing to less expenditure on healthcare. I think we have to keep that in mind. Equally large presence of private and corporate health sector. Post health sector reforms, we have seen the growth of private sector in India. However, this was given priority to expand by the government, and also with the support of a lot of public subsidies, whereby we can see that a lot of public subsidies go into the building and running of the private sectors. Looking at COVID-19 response, the communities have showed tremendous resilience. And as usual in other previous disasters, and presently in COVID-19, we have seen large number of migrants quietly walking back to hometown hundreds of miles without protest, looting or stealing. Though one can see this as a resilience, but at the same time, this is very heartbreaking and disturbing as the sudden lockdown fallout. So one can see the unexpected lockdown, sudden lockdown really left the people in lurch, and then no support system in the rural area, especially for the migrant workers who were living in the rented houses, were not supported in terms of giving them free rent free of the rent, which mostly the owners asked them to leave because they were not in a position to pay the rent, and not seeing any work in future also led many of them to just walk back. It took some time for the government to react and get the transport system in place to take them back home. But again, that was another issue because taking the people from the cities to rural areas, which means spreading the virus from the cities to rural areas which were untouched by then. So there were a lot of issues related to migrant workers and further disasters as usual. And this pandemic, especially at a national scale, have exposed the deep-seated inequalities in the society. Now, reasons may be seeing that West, when pandemic started with China and Germany and US, and many deaths happening, and even the best infrastructure, most of these advanced countries were not in a position to contain, and there were high death rates happening there. Probably the situation in India was also to lock down immediately to contain any deaths further. And to a large extent, this was helping us to contain a huge number of deaths, which we were successful to a large extent, and also got time to prepare with the PPEs and raising the number of beds in the hospitals to an extent that we got time to prepare, made a lot of makeshift arrangements in case of spread of virus, whereby hotels, stadiums, even train coaches were converted into beds. And this was largely, one can say, a success. March 24th lockdown, we had 4 phases of lockdown, 1, 2, 3, 4. But lot of economic losses, not just small, medium enterprises, even large industries have been hit hard. And for the unorganized sector workers, as per the economic survey of 2007-8, 93% of India's workforce include self-employed and employed in unorganized sector. So one can see the huge impact on the SMEs and also the contract laborers who all mostly come from rural background and settle in cities. So as per National Sample Survey Organization, 30 million workers in India are constantly on the move. They are the migrant workers. And over 122 million people in India lost their jobs in April 2020. According to the estimate from Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, around 75% of them were small traders and wage laborers, which means almost 83.2 million population of Germany. More than that have lost their jobs in this COVID-19. Now, the center and state pitched in sending the migrants back home through special trains from May 1st onwards, after 40 days of lockdown. However, it was a tough decision as the worry was not to spread the virus from urban centers to rural India with even less healthcare services in the rural countryside. Now, there were a lot of fears, uncertainties, rumors, fake news, and the nature of virus, which has been changing. A lot of worries, anxiety, psychological factors are all one can witness. Now, there's been an effect of long-term lockdown in many homes which are crowded and pose different challenges. Further, media reporting of increase in domestic violence, child abuse as the consequences of job loss, frustrations mounting. On the other hand, we have seen that the digital mode of learning and working have started with internet and webinars all across the offices which are working, and even the school children have gone online for education. However, we have to flag that not everyone has the facilities of the internet and computers, and majority cannot afford laptops and internet connections. So thereby the digital divide one can witness. Now, we have started with unlocking. Now unlocking first phase is over, now second, and there are huge challenges ahead. Huge task for the central and the state governments to engage the workforce in the smaller villages and towns and cities. Focus is to build on skill development, Atmanirbhar, which means self-reliant, India to improve the economy, and time to rethink on the processes of development so far, or look for more sustainable solutions on various fronts, be it environment, public health, education, equitable distribution of resources, reduction of poverty, and focus on rural India. So there are huge challenges ahead, and this is the time, I think, for a paradigm shift in understanding the Indian society and trying to bring in equitable distribution of resources and also development, which is not, I mean, I see as a disaster professional, there's a huge uh, connection between disaster and development. So we need to really think through the kind of development we are having currently and how we can change that for a sustainable future ahead for the larger good. Thank you so much.
Super. Thank you very much, Sunita. I've written down a few points, and I'd like to ask Dilip now to continue with a statement from Johannesburg.
Thank you. It's good to be here chatting with old friends again. And even though the circumstances are not of our own choosing and we have to negotiate these huge distances using internet, I think one of the fundamental questions that the present crisis has allowed us to do is to think about what do viruses allow us to think? Because in one sense, we have to ask the question that the Italian philosopher Agamben asked, are epidemic crises similar to political crisis? Do they lead to similar consequences? Because as we know, both sets of crises, both the epidemic crisis and the political crisis, leads to forms of strengthening of the state, leads to certain strains within society, and also results in consequences which move towards constraining people within certain paradigms of technologies of control. So these are some of the things that I would like to speak about. The three themes basically, and each of the three themes is 3 points. So that's 9 things that I will say, just in case you were in any suspense about how long I would go on. The first theme is that of the state. And here, one of the things that's interesting is that before the epidemic started, we already had signs of political unrest. So for example, under the violent Hindu nationalist government in India, you had the Citizenship Amendment Act and a whole series of political protests, universities, on the streets, and so on. You had the emerging turmoil in the United States with the attempts to impeach Donald Trump. So what we've had is nations led by populist political parties in a state of turmoil. The coming of the virus has allowed a certain form of political control because political dissent can no longer be expressed on the streets. Networks of political action, social networks are all controlled. So what we've seen is a strengthening of the state, and this is what the economists called forms of pan-democracy, democracy in a situation of pandemic. And aligned with this increasing control of the state, the suppression of political dissent, we know recently that the forms of political dissent in Hong Kong are now more or less ended, right? China has taken over control of Hong Kong. There have been forms of surveillance, which leads to the second point, again, to take a word from the economist, of the coronopticon, that the coronavirus has generated a panopticon of surveillance on the parts of most states, where identifying political actors, identifying political dissidents, containing them, controlling them has become crucial. So the state has actually emerged as a much more widespread and penetrating phenomenon all over the world right now, as the nation state has come to be seen as the means through which the virus can be controlled. The virus, of course, respects no borders, right? It moves freely across these, but we seem to worship the holy grail of the nation state. And so that's one point. The second thing is that increasingly we can see that states are performing a punitive function more and more. We have seen police violence across the globe, right? Whether it's in the United States, in India, in South Africa, large numbers of people have been thrown into prison. Around 200,000 people are in prison in South Africa for violation of petty rules like breaking curfew and so on. So the state has emerged in its punitive function. State leadership has emerged in a performative function. I mean, so for example, Narendra Modi, Bolsonaro, Trump have been characterized by a complete incompetence with regard to a handling of the crisis, but in terms of a performative, where everything is done for the media, it's done staged, it's stage managed, and so on. So you have the punitive aspect of the state, you have the performative aspect of people like Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, and of course, Boris Johnson in England. And what we initially used to think of as the pastoral functions of the state as a characterized by the need to care for people. So you think about the demise of public health systems, the undermining of public health systems, the fact that people are very much thrown on their own and the state is no longer performing that pastoral function of governing populations, of taking care of populations. So the question is, what will come out after all of this? And in some sense, while I've presented a rather gloomy dystopian picture of strengthening state control and surveillance, what is interesting is that if you look at what happened in the US right now, if the virus is something that attacks our breath, right, our breathing, the coronavirus, it's interesting that the one death that happened in the US of George Floyd, with the policeman kneeling on a black man's neck and murdering him by preventing him from breathing, it actually touched a nerve all over the world, so that Black Lives Matter has received a fillip as a result of this. And what you see is in the United States, a kind of political turmoil which brings out people onto the street. So just as much as the Republicans are coming out saying, I will not wear masks, large numbers of people on the left and the liberal left spectrum are emerging on the streets and protest against these forms of state violence, political violence, and racial violence in the United States. In India, Sunita mentioned that large numbers of migrants, a great abandonment of labor that's happened in India, where all the migrants who moved from the east to the west are now walking back, right, a few thousand kilometers. This has resulted in the Migrant Workers Solidarity Network. There have been over 150 protests by 100,000 workers. So again, there is a new politics that's emerging here as a result of this abandonment, because we all know that once the corona crisis is over, what we shall see are greater controls being exercised by state and capital over labor. And we've already seen this happening in northern states like the United Province, like Uttar Pradesh, where labor legislation has just been scrapped. So around 35 acts have been scrapped, so that when labor comes back, it can be kept in place to work to restore productivity. The second point about societies, in a country like India, I mean, we are a violent, inegalitarian, hierarchical society based on caste, and physical distancing is what we practice. We don't even marry one another, right? And we don't fall in love with one another. It's all governed for the Hindus by caste, and also for Muslims and Christians by caste-like ascriptive kinds of characteristics. So physical distancing is happening in a space where there is already physical distancing. So what is going to be the consequence of this in terms of the relations between human beings, which are already hierarchical? So that you've seen, for example, within the home, that a lot of domestic laborers are not being paid, domestic laborers have lost their jobs, domestic laborers are seen as the vectors of disease. So all of the structures of society, the deep structures of prejudice and separation that govern society, and this is a point that I'll return to, whether indeed we can talk about society given the increased fragmentation. And this is true across the globe. I'm taking India as a particular example. So what happens in hierarchical and divided society? So in India, of course, it's a question of caste and the increasing fractures that are emerging between people. If you think about America, it's questions of race, right? What we are seeing here is probably a kind of racial division in America, which we haven't seen for probably around 50 years, where the idea of being white and black reflects positions of power and disempowerment. And politics is being structured precisely by this racial fault line. In Europe, of course, it's questions of religion. Europe increasingly has begun to define itself as Christian with the influx of Muslim immigrants. And we see in the case of France, for example, that you can be fined for not wearing a mask, and you can be fined if you wear the veil and you mask yourself. So the question of Islam within Europe has surfaced as a major issue. I mean, it started with the migrants, the Syrian migrants coming over a few years ago. But this question of race, caste, and religion within societies, the ideas of social distancing and physical distancing, which COVID has brought about, what are going to be the consequences? Now, how will society be reconstituted? What are the new forms of sociality that will emerge? Can we restore ideas of fraternity within societies which see themselves as equal societies, societies which guarantee liberties? But whether it's in the US, whether it's Europe, or whether it's in India, this question of fraternity, how do we live together after the COVID crisis, will become a crucial question. How are we going to reconstitute societies where the fault lines have actually been strengthened? The fault lines have, the cracks have widened. Thirdly, the question of the individual. And I think this is an important question where how are we to identify the individual, and the focus on the face has become very crucial, where increasingly, as you can see in the media and elsewhere, people are talking about the mask and the loss of forms of individuality and so on, which of course are very, the reflections of able-bodied people, right? I mean, we were talking about this earlier. What does the mask mean for a visually challenged person? They're not identifying human beings by their face. So the mask is merely something that's a cosmetic thing. But this idea of face and loss of face, how does it tie up with questions of individuality and indeed with questions of citizenship, right? I mean, if you think about ways in which people get masked by the mask, what are the ways in which individuals can make themselves visible as citizens in the public sphere? The second question here is that of questions of solitude, questions of mental depression, questions of well-being, that increasingly we have realized that the presence of bodies is integral to our well-being, that despite our global connectivity, through TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, the fact of having 1.8 million followers and so on, in the end, you are drawn in on yourself. And this has generated a huge crisis in the world of the question of solitude. How can individuals be by themselves and still retain a sense of sanity, well-being, health, and so on? And the necessity to have bodies around one. To go back to what we were saying earlier about the kind of physical distancing, it's important for all of us to just step out and be on the road and see people, right? I mean, it's not enough to, and this is something that we are realizing far more. Finally, the question of the family, because increasingly, again, all over the globe, and here there's no difference between the first world, the second world, the global north, the global south. Fundamentally, gender-based violence has increased. Families are the sites of domestic violence. Families are not a retreat, a haven from a heartless world. Families have become the sites of violence, and looking at the statistics in Delhi is frightening. Usually these instances aren't reported, but the Deputy Commissioner of Police spoke recently about how 1,000 calls a day are being received, by local police stations. So I think here these questions that we have to ask are about a present crisis and about a future reconstitution. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Thank you, Dilip. Thanks a lot to you as well. And the third person to give a statement is Fernando.
Okay, well, thank you all, Gabi, putting us together. Very nice to be with Dilip and Sunita too. Thanks, Robert, too, for organizing all this. Well, I'm glad that Dilip perhaps has already anticipated some of my points here, so I think we can talk about all these things later on. I'll try to make to give some impressions of what's going on now in Brazil. First of all, I must say I'm located in Rio, right, in a city of around 7 million people. In Great Rio, we're talking about 12 million people inhabitants. So it's a huge city in a country of, which is Brazil, of high levels of social, economic, and educational inequalities. So in this sense, it's impossible to talk about pandemia in Brazil without talking about what I'm thinking as a politics of the pandemia, which is to do a lot with how government is dealing with the problem, right? What I'm saying here first is that it's impossible to talk about pandemia as if it were detached from the political collapse that we have all been confronted with here in Brazil. So what happens is that we are obliging to understand how close this lethal virus can be to a political regime that is deliberately putting under threat what we understand about democracy. So there is a relation there that I think it's very strongly being experienced by us in Brazil. We're talking about a government that is very much concentrated on the idea of annihilating whatever and whoever thinks differently from its interests. As Dilip said, I mean, it's not only being punitive, but also performative. And these things, they mix together, and it's very interesting to think about them. For instance, just to give you an example of what happened last week, this president, he vetoed the obligation of using masks in churches, in stores, and schools by claiming that this was a violation of private property. So what I'm trying to say here is how much we have to be fighting with some basic things that are being now, put upside down, right? So all these actions, I mean, this punitive action, these performative actions, they're being built under neoliberal statements, like, the economy minister saying that the market, the economy, they are the strongest principles that we should be attentive to, which bring us back to the issue of development, if you want to talk about this afterwards. So this is a discourse, a whole discourse that is being sustained by what we have been experiencing in Brazil, and again, not only in Brazil, but very strongly in Brazil, what's been called the rise of a neo-fascism. I think this is very important for us to put together in order to think with the virus, as this roundtable suggests, right? So what I'm trying to think of is from the perspective of a political collapse that has become, if we want to think of 2016 as like a triggering point, when there was what we have been calling and understanding as a parliamentary and a mediatic coup, right, based on fake news, based on political games, political stunts that have put in power through elections. This is also very important. So somehow democracy would be working, right? An absolute, extremely righteous president who is clearly involved in crimes of corruption and all other types of crimes, and who has been dealing with the pandemic in his own words, as a little flu, right? Something that this is what he said right in the beginning. So this government, this federal government, has no public policy towards what is happening, right? For instance, as an example too, it's been today 51 days that we have no health minister in power. We have no one to relate to, right? So there is no public federal voice towards the sanitary and the health problem with which the world is being confronted. We have somehow become dependent on some state governors and some municipal leaders who have been kind of counterpoints in what the federal government doesn't do. But these are very dispersed actions throughout a huge country, that Brazil is, right? Well, from public perspective, it has with great difficulties liberated some emergential financial support of around 100, 120 euros for those who are in need, who are more fragile in terms of work, right? This is a big fight. I mean, it's got to do this, but we don't know how long it lasts. And then all the time they say they're going to take it away. And the government is in fact moving on with the planning of dismantling everything that is public, and basically what is to do with health and what is to do with education. As Dilip also mentioned, this is something that has already started before the virus, right? So it's just going on. That's very interesting. Of course, meanwhile, we can talk about some collective actions, perhaps some collective resilience, if we can say so. Many social movements, civil actions, for instance, in the slums, in the favelas of Rio, some organized groups trying to collect food and all kinds of help by crowdfundings and all these type of actions to help people who do not have what to eat and who need to work but cannot work because things have been closed. We also could call the attention for what many of the public universities have been doing, like taking the responsibility of providing people with psychological, medical, all kinds of help, though these public universities are, the aim of the government of the dismantling process. And also some very important actions by the public health system also being dismantled, but doing the most precise work of receiving the infected ones, right? I think it's also interesting to remember that here in Brazil, in Rio, we have Fiocruz, which is one of the best known epidemiology center in Latin America. So we have great public agencies, right, that could handle the virus somehow in a as well as possible way. But we are fighting against this federal government and this political collapse that we have been facing. We also could call the attention for some isolated actions, some public intellectuals, some specialists, certain politicians, certain artists, well, some groupings that have been giving voice to what we need, what should be done, right? We have one Brazilian neuroscientist based in the United States, for instance, who is coordinating from Duke University a center that is monitoring the virus, confronting the federal government in practical terms like numbers and all these kind of things. This Dr. Miguel Nicolelis, he said once in the papers that Brazil perhaps is facing one of the major war in the history of the country because it's a biological war. That's his words towards what we're facing here. That's what I'm trying to think as what I'm thinking as the politics of the pandemic in Brazil, right? Which has this way of acting towards the pandemic has helped exacerbate facts we already knew of, but perhaps it's coming out now more strongly. One of them is the idea of the fragility of democracy. We're talking about a country and a continent that has experienced dictatorship not a long time ago, right? So the fact of understanding more precisely how fragile democracy is in Brazil is a big issue nowadays. And also the fact of our understanding that democracy in Brazil, as it's said by a poet, Ricardo Aleixo here, democracy is white. And this is to do with the racial problem. This is to do with power. I mean, the same type of issues that Dilip has raised before. We had very recently a statement by a famous rapper in Brazil. His name is Emicida. And he said, he was very precise when he said that what is extremely lethal in Brazil are the social abysms that the society has produced and that still pretends not to exist. He says, this is his words, this is what amplifies the virus lethality. And I think this is very precise. And what he's saying, in other words, is that in Brazil, the virus has made evident the problem of inequalities, right? This is what has raised as the biggest issue for us, nothing that we didn't know of, right? I mean, we always talk about this for many years, right? But it's come out now as something very strong. It is to do with social, economic, educational. It's got to do with class, gender, and racial problems altogether. Well, what I'm saying here is that in a general sense, the pandemic has activated and has made more evident what we could call so as a crisis of capitalism and its relation to democracy, right? The fragility of democracy, I think we should start to understand, I mean, and be more acute in this, is also to do with the fact that democracy is inscribed as part of an economic and political system that very much depends on the inequalities it produces. So making this connection between democracy, capitalism, and the inequalities that have been the issue in Brazil, I think is something that goes to a global scale. It's something that is bigger than only thinking of it from the perspective of Brazil, right? Alberto Acosta, who is an Ecuadorian who thinks about this buen vivir concept, he talks about capitalism, the capitalist system, as being the civilization of inequality, right? I mean, he criticizes this very strongly when he's talking about buen vivir. I think we should start thinking and talking about this, right? Well, then following the problems, I'm trying here to enumerate and trying to think with the virus as it is suggested by the roundtable. What I'm saying here is that this connection between capitalism, inequality, and the fact of our learning how interdependent the whole world is, I guess this is also what the virus is being showing to us, right? Makes me think, and this is part of an argument of something which we can talk about, that inequality itself is what turns out to be pandemic, right? I think this is the biggest issue we are dealing with, and this is not a problem of global south. It's not a problem of a specific place. As I'm trying to understand, this is a global scale problem that we should start thinking and start dealing with. Well, just to begin with, Gabi, thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you for all the statements. I will just say a few words about my thinking about this blurb. First of all, I would like to start with the paradox that many of us, of my colleagues, experience, is that we are sitting at home doing our Zoom webinars, Zoom seminars. And when we open the news or Facebook, we see that the world is in a crisis. People are dying, people are suffering everywhere. And at the same time where we sit, the sun is shining and we are free to go out to buy some bread or to take a coffee. And this is, I think, one of the paradoxes, that it's like watching a film. Watching it in the news, and it is here, but it's not here, and we don't know when it's coming. And this is, I think, one of the issues that makes it, especially in Germany, where we are not next door to the people in India who are crossing the roads to get back to their homes, or in Brazil where we can observe other things, or in Italy where many of my friends, Italian friends, have experienced other friends or family members dying, is that the way people deal with the pandemic becomes very, very, very different. So there is, on the one hand, there is a group of people in Germany who is very aware of these wearing a mask, keeping a distance, not going to crowds, trying to not get infected or infect others. And then there is a new group emerged, which goes on the street, demonstrating in huge groups, asking for freedom, because they see the government's regulation not as a precaution to, or as a health measurement, but as a way of ruling those people who are free and who lose the freedom by these new contact rules. So this is something I think it's quite, for me, it is a unique thing to see people who have never been political, who have never gone on a demonstration to fight against inequality or freedom and other ways of thinking, to do this now. And at the same time, conspiracy theories are getting a new shape. Our epidemiologists, our doctors, our health ministers get death threats because they are seen as being part of a big conspiracy circle, together with the WHO and other names I don't want to name here now. But this new thinking about the state, who for one part of the society suddenly is a hero because they try to keep after their people, they build up hospitals and they give money to those who lost their job. For the other group becomes a fascist regime, which is trying to take people away from their freedom. And they are saying, when I have to wear the mask, I can't breathe. This is my freedom, I want to breathe. So this is one of the interesting aspects I see developing, which I haven't experienced before in Germany. The other thing is the new interdependencies between groups and individuals. Suddenly, society gets aware of people living in crowded homes, working in meat factories, coming from Eastern Europe or other countries, or even from Germany, and this is where the infections herds are. And suddenly there is an awareness that these people who did these jobs under really terrible conditions for a long time, that these people are important for us. So the awareness that there are other groups that are treated very badly, that don't earn a lot of money, like nurses and everybody working in the health sector, this has created a new consciousness. And at the same time, there is a new term has emerged. It's called system relevant. So the question was, who is allowed to go out? Who is allowed to work? Who is important for society? These are people who are relevant for the system. So the system, as a system that has to work, has become a new dimension and has been articulated in a way that it has never been before. The other thing that is interesting is the relations between generations. First of all, we could see in the beginning, it's changing now, that the younger generations would create parties, rave parties, secret parties in the parks or in basements, in clubs, saying, well, this doesn't concern us because we won't get infected, and if we do get infected, it takes 2 weeks and we are out of it. But the older generation said, if you get infected, we might get infected, because you might be our grandsons or granddaughters' friends. People mix, so your risky behavior might affect me. So this has put up the question of generations, or different risk groups, different groups at risk, and their behavior. What does my individual behavior mean? Just not for me. It's not me jumping down a bridge. It's me taking a risk, putting other people at risk. This again has put these interrelations at a different consciousness, and the awareness how often we meet and interact in the supermarket, in the aeroplane, on the street, in the classroom, is something that people have never thought about. So as Dilip also said, and I think a few of you, the others as well, the need for contact to lead a healthy life in a way that we feel healthy socially and mentally is something that suddenly comes up. And I think you all said that. What are people making out of this? A crisis is an interesting term, because in medicine, a crisis is the point where the patient has a high fever and either he dies or he lives on. So the crisis is the point of a decision. So where do we go from here? I think what's coming out is that in Germany, many people say, wow, suddenly we realize we don't have to travel. We don't have to go out all the time. We don't need all these consumer goods. Hopefully this will stay. Hopefully people will not fly to Munich from Berlin once a week because they have to go for a meeting for 2 hours. Hopefully we can take the digital experiences with us. Hopefully people will keep in mind that many of these aims, these goals that we had for sustainable, eco-friendly life, they can be reached, even if we thought half a year ago this is never possible. So this is one debate that's going on. The other debate is also about inequality. There's an awareness about the inequalities that's coming up because the virus washes the inequalities up and enhances them in different ways, in completely different ways compared to India or Brazil or probably South Africa. But still, we can see inequalities. The space you have for your own disposal where you live. Do you have one room with a family, or do you have 3 rooms as an individual? Can you go out and buy expensive masks? Or are you so short with money that you can't protect yourself? All these little things that that are maybe not relevant on a huge political scale, but they are relevant for the people who live these lives. They've been washed up and they are circulated in the minds and in the politics. The interesting thing is that our right-wing party, the AfD, they have not gained voices and voters. On the contrary, they have been, I think they have, this is what they say in the polls, because they can't come up with a solution. So the state as the savior has become very important. Many people are very grateful to the state that they give money for those people who have lost their jobs, who can't open their restaurants, who can't drive their cabs, who can't open their whatever barber shops and so on. So the state has taken up a new role as a body of like a parent role. You know, I'll take care. You know, you don't worry, it's difficult, but here I am. Now I'm there. I take care. And I wonder where this goes. I wonder how this will go on with the politics. Okay, but I'll stop here. These are just a few thoughts that I find interesting, because we wanted to also think about what is new. And now we have half an hour for discussion, or even a bit more. And then we have 15 minutes for questions and answers. And the first question I would like to ask is about these new forms of sociality. Sorry, people becoming social because they share suddenly the same needs. So my question would be, and this would go, I think, would go to all three of you. Of course, caste is reinforced and economic status is reinforced through the pandemic. But are there also movements where suddenly people reconnect because they are part of a group of sufferers, or they are in the same boat of trying to protect themselves, to live on, to live a life, to be economically firm? Is there also something that crisscrosses these divisions that we know? This would be my question. Maybe we'll start with Sunita and then go to Dilip and then go to Fernando. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gabi. When we look at the current scenario, as I mentioned in the beginning about the movement of migrants going back home, there is this realization saying that cities, of course, the pull and push factors which led them to move from rural to urban. Now with the crisis and nobody supporting them, there is a tendency to think that we are fine at the back home. I mean, at least we can survive there and there are people around who will take care of us, rather than cities, which is completely alien for them. As long as they're able-bodied and working and have jobs and the work, they are valuable. But the moment this crisis came up and they are left behind without any support system. And that's where a lot of movement in terms of not even waiting for any transport, walking down. I mean, it's unimaginable for us to think, how can a person just walk? I mean, start walking with the luggage, with small children, without any transport, thinking that they'll reach to their destination hundreds of miles. So the point is that they completely felt that there is no support system, and now realizing that back home we'll be taken care with our own family members. And the whole, I think the fear of the pandemic also, that we may die, and if we have to die, let us die with our own people. That was one thinking which was coming through. And also some of even the retired people and some of the youth who have lost jobs. City, and especially Delhi, was a place where everybody had a lot of aspirations to move up and social mobility and economic mobility. But then of late, they now also feel that given the pandemic situation where nothing is important except for food, water, shelter, they are willing to go back to their hometowns. And I've been hearing that many of them have now started moving back to their whichever state they have come from, so that they can go back and be with their own people, and whatever limited economic opportunities they have, they can live better life, because Delhi being again lot polluted, lot of traffic and crisis, and many a times all these different ups and downs in the political systems, and also loss of jobs. So I suppose that that's where people are now coming back. And one point which you also raised about the basic fundamental things which are available. Possibly now people are realizing that too much of money, too much of luxuries may not be that important. What is important is simplicity and living a life with your own people, and relationships have become important. Even a lot of NRI population from India who thinks that it's better to come back home and be with your own people, because there's so much of uncertainty all around. And probably these are some of the points which I can put right away, and then maybe I can think of more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunita. Dilip.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I'd just like to circle through some of the things that were raised. And I think it's important for us to stress that nothing has been revealed as a result of the coronavirus, right? Nothing new has happened. The world has actually emerged to us as it actually is, right? So we have come to understand that the world is undergirded by inequality, that the world is undergirded by the fragility of democracy, the world is undergirded by the violence of states, and so on and so forth. So the virus has actually been a ripping off of the veil of our illusions, about the world that we live in. And that's important for us because that's what then allows us to start thinking. So for example, you think about Britain, right? Since Brexit and the politics that led up to Brexit and subsequently, and the increasing disinvestment that's happening in the National Health Service, the idea of herd immunity being very strong, there has been what the philosopher Robert Esposito called a thanatopolitics, a politics of death, where people have just been abandoned. It's a kind of Malthusian principle that some will die, some will survive. So in that sense, many things which are inherent have become apparent. But to get to the question of new socialities, I think we need to start re-engaging with our cynicism regarding the media, right? I mean, if you think about the fact that while we cannot actually move across the globe, actually our connectivity has increased. I mean, I'm having a conversation with Sunita and Fernando. I can have it every day now, right? I mean, until they say, look, hey, this is getting a bit too much, right? But this question of a separation is being aligned with an increased connectivity with people. So that, for instance, just as an anecdotal thing, more people are saying, let's Zoom instead of call. People who would have called me now want to see my face, right? So there's a mediated effectivity that is happening where new forms of sociality, greater connectivities are emerging as we realize, I think, the fragility of our lives. Because in one sense, there is a horizon in our mind that, we don't know who will be alive 2 weeks down the line, 3 weeks down the line, and so on and so forth, which demands a certain connectivity with parents, relatives, friends, even people like us. So that's, who are academic colleagues. That's one thing. The second thing is the profusion of the resort to things like TikTok videos. So if you get onto the TikTok space, people are putting up videos of family life, of cooking, of games, of dances. It's a whole world that is out there, which is a record of everyday life about how people are reconstituting forms of well-being, forms of subjectivity. And again, our snobbery and our cynicism regarding these forms, which has generally been, there since the time of Adorno and Horkheimer, about mass culture being the site of some mindlessness, we can actually see new forms of life, new forms of connectivities that are emerging, which we need to be attentive to. And connected with this again is the fact that webinars are now proliferating like the virus itself. I mean, there are like only 1 million webinars that you can't attend, right? Earlier you used to say, so many seminars. Now it's like 1 million webinars. But here I think the interesting thing that's happening is that this is one way in which this can go in two ways, right? So the Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google, has basically been saying, look, why do we need universities? Why do we need all this real estate, classrooms and buildings? They could be used for something else. All we need is camera and basically classes can be held. That's one way to go. The other way to go is how does the university rethink its sociality, rethink its place in the world, rethink its place within a kind of radical pedagogy where all of these things that we are doing, which are recorded, are now available to those who are not enrolled at universities, right? So we were hesitant about massive online courses, about MOOC courses. I remember all of our universities were saying, man, we need the actual aura of the teacher. A lot of it arose from the narcissism of individual academics themselves. But now we see that what we produce at the universities can be made available in across the globe. And it is a moment when people across the globe are actually listening. So how do we think with that? I think that is something that we really need to think about in terms of a radical educational culture emerging. We could even think about Paulo Freire in the time of this media, right? In where you can actually think about reaching out to people across national borders in a way that we were hesitant to do earlier. Not that we couldn't do it earlier, but we were hesitant to, because we were all very safe and ensconced in our spaces. So I think there are multiple radical possibilities of forms of sociality which are emerging right now. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks a lot, Dilip. Fernando.
I'll try to be objective. I mean, it's such a complicated thing, because thinking of these new forms of socialities, I cannot help thinking from the perspective of what has already happened before that. I mean, these forms of, I think it's about to do what Dilip also said. I mean, there's nothing, perhaps there is nothing so new, but the fact that there is an emergency of a problem that has come out that obliges us in general to act differently somehow, right? For instance, if we take the issues of the slums, I'm talking about the city of Rio. Of course, Brazil is a huge country, so I'm really, you know, I'm really talking about a very specific thing, right? A very specific situation. The slums in Brazil, in general, they have always been out of the view of the state, right? I mean, the state has never really paid close attention to that. There is one program or another once, you know, in a certain political action, but this then ends up doing nothing. So we kind of, we deal with this for many years already, right? So what the slums, they have to deal with basic sanitary needs, with no proper public transportation, you know, informal jobs, with police violence. So this is something that's going on for ages, right? What happens now with this virus is that it seems that there is a box of Pandora that has opened, and now these problems, they become even more emergent than they have always been. So this is how I see what's going on now, when, for instance, we have a group of people working on crowdfundings for collecting money to help those who need to eat, you know, within this pandemic environment, right? Within the emergence of what's going on at the moment. This is how I see, for instance, how these actions, they reach the media, perhaps in a stronger way than before. But again, we are talking about something that is happening now. That's the impression we have, right? For instance, the first registered death we have in Brazil is of a 63-year-old woman. Her name was Cleonice, and she died. She worked as a maid in a certain house, right? And she died because she was taking care of her boss, right? The woman in the house, who had just come back from Europe. And this woman had contracted the virus, and then her maid, right? That's how the media also said, got infected and died. This death has made such an impact in the country that it's got to do with the emergency of the problem that we're facing now. It's hard to say and to think now whether this is going to provoke any kind of change. What is happening now is that things have brought out very many special issues that we have been dealing with for ages, now coming in a faster way, in a stronger way all over, right? So this has provoked, for instance, lots of talks, lots of seminaries, lots of understandings, and people coming from all kinds of disciplines, and also, for instance, a very interesting phenomenon that is happening nowadays. It is a person called Galo, and he is kind of an anti-fascist worker of the delivery, the food delivery, right? He works with these APP things, and he's talking very, in all kinds of places about the conditions they all have. So it seems that he's kind of becoming a certain leader, being able to refer to the problem they're dealing with. This is somehow new, though perhaps it existed in a more, covered way. So these kind of things, they're coming out very strongly for us now. Whether this is a big change, I mean, whether this is going to provoke a big change or not, where this is going to take us, I don't think we can think about it. What we can do now is like enumerate things that are happening, like these connectivities with perhaps events and perhaps phenomena that we did not know of, that it's now easier for us to reach through the internet and so. But this is a very, I think it's still a very little, very slight part of the problem that we are facing nowadays. I mean, they're coming out together, and I think we have to balance them, right? But what is the biggest issue that you mentioned before, Gabi, is this issue of who is allowed, but I mean, I would not say allowed, right? But who needs to go out to work, who can stay home, right? This makes the whole big difference, at least in Brazil, which is to do with the racial problem, it's to do with the gender problem, it's to do with what we've been talking about, necropolitics, which is the biggest issue, the biggest topic here nowadays. I mean, related to the problems we're facing when we think about these socialities that are coming out, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, what came up, I got it a little bit from Sunita, but also from Fernando, and also from Dilip a little bit, is that despite the inequalities that are washed up and that are really enhanced and put many people in positions nobody would have ever thought before, there is still some movements of solidarity coming up. And this is, I think, typical, or this shows in studies, for example, on cancer patients being on a cancer ward, that suddenly class, economic status, background doesn't matter. They form a group of sufferers who develop solidarities in certain aspects. Or after the tsunami, there have been many studies, especially in South India, on new developments after the tsunami, where suddenly some groups were differentiated more, and caste issues came up and inequalities came up, but other inequalities went away, or not went away, but were becoming lighter. So this is something I would find interesting. How is what are the solidarities that are coming up as an answer or a reply from society to the inequalities that are experienced, or how much is a solidarity suppressed by the general suffering, or by the situation that creates capitalistic play fields for people who want to earn more money. This is the other thing that we see, that many people exploit this situation. Firms, businesses, individuals exploit these situations immensely. So I'll ask one more question, and I think then we go to the question and answer round. One thing I owe this point to Dilip. He brought it up, and I think it's really interesting that through these lockdowns and the whole situation, our working routine has completely changed. This kind of normal work day, starting in the morning till the evening, early evening, working 8 hours in one go, has suddenly disappeared. For us, I think for all of us who are sitting here, we work from home. We can now change our time cycles. We don't have to go out. But this is not just for us, this is for many people. The routine has changed, the temporalities have changed. With the lockdown, many people have been sitting at home, waiting, trying to work, not being able to work, doing other work. And this would be something, this kind of these temporalities of the pandemic. How does this affect you, and how is it taken up in your discourse, in your neighborhood, among your friends, but also in the media in your respective regions? If you could say a few words about this, not too much because we want to go to question and answers, but I would be very interesting how this is kind of lived out and reflected upon in the 4 different fields where we are. So maybe we start with Sunita again. If you could say, if you want to, it would be great if you could say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's a very important question, given that the routines have changed while all of us locked down in the houses, and especially when we have all these restrictions of, even now with the unlocking, that you cannot go in different places or you cannot invite people. Routines for different people, I think, is very important. If you look at children, I mean, there was no harm if we can delay education for 6 months or so and leave them at home where they can work on their creativities, and there can be many ways to engage them. But given the same old rote, kind of rote learning and the importance given to the education system, that we again have the same kind of schedule where the child is to get up at 7, sit in front of the computer for 4 hours a day, and even evening classes at 4 o'clock with physical education. So it's like quite interesting thing to see how things have again been routinized, but then through digital medium. And there may be many of the children who are not in a position to even to look at a computer and take those classes. So there's a huge divide over there. Again, youth and elderly, I mean, given there's so much of energy which they want to take it out, with these lockdowns, I'm sure a lot of things happening, that their time schedules for sleeping, eating, and working are all changed. So they're completely disoriented, and a lot of them trying to get engaged in some creative things. There are many ways in which people are coming out with what they have never been doing it. They've been planning, they've been dreaming to, like learning music, dance, or cooking, and many other things which they are getting back to it. I'm not really sure about the elderly, because another demographically, if you look at within India, a lot of aging population increasing, and given the families breaking up, and of late in media again, elderly population being attacked or robbed, or even some of them, and in some cases of suicides going up. I think that's again kind of anomaly which we see. And then looking at the disorientation, people who are have lost their jobs and they're committing suicides. These are some of the very disturbing things which are coming out. Of course, people like us who are into academia, we've got more engaged because of these webinars, and and then we too have to plan our day, because being into academia, I think we are fortunate to some extent that we are still able to continue with our activities of reading, writing, and connecting with people, and participating in discussions and seminars and webinars. I think routine have changed for everyone, I'm sure for that, but then how, for many, it is definitely a difficult phase to go about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, I think it all depends on one's temperament. It depends also on whether one has a job and an income coming in regularly. Because one of the things that's happened is that we're all working more, I think. Both my wife and I, we are working more, in the sense that there's no distinction between work and home. We are sometimes we're having these meetings on webinar and so on. I'm reading and writing at different points in the day. But for me, the important thing is that I'm doing it with my family. For me, this is the most wonderful thing that has ever happened. That I'm getting time, I can get up from my table and go chat with my wife, play with my children, and come back to work. That I can cook in the morning rather than in the evening in a rushed kind of way when I come back from work. That we can cook together, cooking with the children, playing cricket with my son. All of this is possible, and I'm still working, because this is a break from the work that I'm doing. So for me, it's what it has done is actually made me realize the importance of the time that I get with my family. And I think this is the ideal form of work in some sense. It's really like the Marx's dream of, working and then fishing and reading and so on and so forth. All of that is happening in the course of a day. So that's one thing. The second thing I think is that, like for example, when you talk, Sunita mentioned the elderly, my mother stays with my sisters. My sisters are both working, right? And so they are out most of the day. My mother is ecstatic that my younger sister is at home all the time now, right? And she's They spend time together, she's cooking, they're chatting, all kinds of things are happening. So it depends on circumstances. But I think this issue of the distinction between work and leisure, lockdown has allowed one to rethink that and to bring work and leisure and emotional intimacy all together. Because I think as a family, we've never been happier. It's like an extended holiday. To get this kind of time together, we would actually go away 2 weeks somewhere. Now we are at home. But it matters that we have a home. We're not in an apartment, right? We are staying in a house, we have a little garden, we can step out, all of that. So I think that's, there are other things that I want to say, but since I'll just address a specific question and stop here.
Thanks.
Okay, now, right? Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, one thing we need to think of is that these routines, at least again, in terms of such a complex society as the Brazilian society, and I think it's the same with the Indian society in some, specific cases. These things, they're mixed and they're juxtaposed. I mean, there are people who have changed their routine either because they can, right? Either because they understand it's necessary, and some others who have not changed their routines because they're not allowed to. I mean, they need to go out to work. They need to keep doing things they did before. So it is as if for them, the virus is not happening somehow. So these routines, I mean, these things, they are mixed and they are juxtaposed. If I speak from my side, for instance, I can complain that yes, I am working much more than ever, but also I cannot forget that I am the privileged one who can stay home and who can cook at home, who have food to eat. Or, this is, I mean, it's so complex when we think about these things, because we have to balance and to point out all these issues that are related to the fact of being able to change my routine, right? I have a job, I have a work that allows me to do this. So, and this in a country where many other people cannot. For instance, if we think about the mothers who have children that are not going to school, and they take care of their children alone, and what can they do with their children, right? If they need to go out to work, what are they going to do with their children? So the routine has changed partially for them, right? How do they cope with this problem? I think this is something we should be attentive to when we talk about these routines and what the virus has produced to us, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what we can see from all the four of us is that, again, those who are privileged, who have a home, who have space, who can go out, who can work from home, for them it might even be favorable to be with a family. I completely feel the same, being able to be at home and not having to travel. It's a big privilege. And those who need to go out or who live in crowded conditions, do have kids who need to go out so they can work, it plays out completely the other way. What I found interesting, a friend of mine who was diagnosed with cancer 10 years ago and survived it, she said to me, well, this feels like my cancer diagnosis. Suddenly everything was canceled. The holiday, the conferences, the theaters I wanted to go to. I didn't know what would come. Everything was open. And she said that we live a life where we plan ahead for next year, for this conference, for next December, we do this, then we do that. And it's like we can see the future and we just navigate through it. And this not being able to navigate through, not knowing what will be next month, what will be the month after, is similar to a diagnosis where you are under a medical regime and you don't know whether you survive or you die. This was, I think it's an interesting, it's an interesting point how routines suddenly, or how we get aware of our routines and our feeling of we know how the future will be only when everything breaks together, more or less. Okay, but first of all, thanks to all three of you. I think we got many important points. What it shows is that the state, the governments, the inequalities that are there, the way the pandemic is handled, these differences, they have their background in the already existing politics and inequalities and the ways how states and societies deal with this now. But they also accelerate these differences, the existing inequalities, the existing political ideals and movements. But maybe at some points they also bring up new things that we haven't experienced before. And now I would like to go into the question and answer. I think, Dilip, you want to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I've been scrolling through some of the questions and I've read all the questions that have come up. If I could speak to some of them, yeah? Right, so there was one question about death, which, our changing relation to death, which I think is a crucial question, because one of the things that has happened during COVID is that we had become used in a period of increased life expectancy to not think about death, right? Very much. That death was something that happened over the course of a life. And now that has been taken away from us. So our attitude to death has changed. But our attitude to death has also changed in other ways, in the sense that death was accompanied by ceremony, ritual, grieving, and so on. And now if a beloved parent were to die, there's no way you are going to be able to go see them, right? Either in the hospital, or you can't organize a funeral service, inviting 50 or 60 people and so on. So there's a question there of an economy, both of affect as well as the actual economy, that the amount of money that one spends, questions of sociality. So I think we'll be rethinking our attitudes towards death as a result of the corona crisis. The second question, one of the questions that came up was with regard to Agamben and this idea of coming face to face with reality, right? So Agamben is, has become a metaphor for a theory that refuses to address reality. If you think about his responses, because the first thing that he said was that, look, one of the things that this is going to do, the coronavirus, is strengthen the state. And so he refused to accede to the kinds of forms of care that the state was prescribing. And then Jean-Luc Nancy had to correct him and say, look, in the end, if you get corona, you will have to actually succumb to these systems of care. You can't stand apart from it, saying that this is the oppressive state that's putting it on us. Agamben also said that if you're thinking about the university is all about liberal education and so on, and the person who actually believes that all teaching should be done online is a fascist, right? Here's an article on that. And increasingly, we have to think that our theory has to be related to the living reality that we occupy, that it has to modify itself. There is no theory that stands before reality. And I think that's a fundamental question that's come to us right now, that we have to think afresh, we have to think anew. And it's not, and it's important not to keep reiterating the kinds of things that we've grown up with. And a final point about the state, and this is a wonderful point that Gabi raised. We are thinking about the neoliberal state, the abdication of functions and so on. And right now we are in a situation like that of the immediately following the Second World War, where the state is also, in many cases, like in Germany, performing a social redistribution function, right? It's actually taking care of people, nurturing the arts and culture, taking care of the indigent, taking care of the unwell, and so on. So will this allow us to think about a newer, more caring form of state that will emerge after the coronavirus, whereas what we see now, right now, is a rabid state in many senses. As states are focusing on their punitive power because the veil has been ripped from our eyes as to what states actually do within societies. So I'll stop there. I don't want to take up other people's time.
Thank you, Dilip. I think thanks for commenting. I don't know whether Sunita or Fernando, whether you would like to say something.
I can, yeah.
Yeah, please.
So I can add on about the point on death. Definitely, there's been a lot of grief among the families where they have lost their dear ones and not able to see. And this has further led to people not really disclosing about the illness. What we have been hearing around is that they're scared of going to the medical facilities which means quarantine and which means no family member around. And definitely, some media reports and some kind of fake news also about piling of dead bodies, not having space for cremation. So these are some of the news, whether it's fake or reality, we are not really sure, because sometimes it's how much data which is coming is real and how much is fake. We are not really sure. So these are some of the apprehensions which families are facing, and definitely not able to give proper death rights and grieve on over the dead is an important psychosocial aspect which one needs to think about. There's one question by, I think, Louise Nana on that's on the how our sensitivity and what the realities become kind of movie, and especially during the COVID. I want to really bring this point of one, the deaths, which I have written a blog and I've shared the link, discounted deaths with the group, and also about the lack of empathy, given this kind of pandemic and in the initial periods of 2-3 months when we could not really, showing our empathy for the fellow people, especially in the class of labor class who are working, and complete apathy with them. But there are a lot of examples also about people who have gone beyond their own means to help out. I mean, they're both good and bad when pandemics happen. And then we have seen community-based organizations, even individuals reaching out to people. And there's a whole lot of frontline workers, whether doctors, nurses, or paramedic staff, even sanitation staff. They have been working day in, day out, even at the risk of getting the infection, taking back home. So there's been now a new way of looking at these frontline workers, the compassion which is coming out among the people, and the importance of the work which they've been doing for the betterment of the community. So, and another point of dignity for work, especially coming from the labor class and doing all the manual work. I think of late there's been little more kind of introspection about the kind of jobs, even the menial and the manual jobs are important, and they need to be given that kind of dignity, is something which is coming up in the general discussions over the period.
Thanks a lot, Sunita. Fernando, would you like to comment on the question of Roberto Robalini, or to the other questions?
I read them very, very, quick here, because it's difficult to read and listen to you at the same time. But what I'm trying to think here as you talk, and also with the questions, is that what we are dealing with in Brazil it's really what's being called a necropolitical state. And this demands urgent actions. The difficult thing about this is that no action can be as urgent as we needed it to be. So we are dealing with certain incapacity of doing things right away at the moment we should be doing that, right? So this makes me, this raises me another question, which is for us here, what kind of war are we really dealing with? I think this is a question we have to ask, at least for me, in terms of what we are experiencing in Brazil. So for instance, just to give an example of how death becomes urgent and how reality, we're not watching a film. Someone, I think Nana mentioned that we are not watching a movie and staying at home. That's not the feeling we have. The real life is going on very strongly, right? For instance, we have about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had a death of a child. I think a 5-year-old child who died because he was left at the house of I'll take it another way. His mother was working in a house, right, as a maid also. Of course, she is Black, and the woman at the house is a white woman. This mother had to take her child with her for the work. Her lady, whatever, her boss, right, told her to go out with the dogs. And she left the child at home with this woman. This child asked for his mother while she was out. This woman told the child to go look for her, and he died when he was going, in the elevator, right? These happenings, they are urgent, and they oblige us not only to think about death, but to think about a system that has naturalized death, as if it were, something that has to happen anyway. And again, this is part of a sentence of the president. People die. That's what he said in the beginning too. People die, that's normal, right? So what we are dealing with here is really, it's got to do with this naturalization of a system that has allowed some people to die and some people to live. Right? So this, I think it's a much more complicated issue that we're dealing with, which brings me back to the idea, and Roberto says that, which is the collapse, total collapse and total failure of the state and the society we have been dealing with. It's a totally failure of what we had thought as minimally possible for us to live together, right? What we are facing here is exactly the fact that it's impossible to live together once we maintain this system going on. And I was saying here, it's just the system of producing inequalities. I think this is the hugest issue, the biggest problem that we're dealing with. And also one thing that I think I should reinforce, because these inequalities and the solidarity movements, I think they cannot be disconnected. I think we have to think that these solidarity movements, they come due to the failure of state. I mean, we cannot see them, we cannot look at them separately, right? They are part of a broken system. They are part of a system that has failed already. So it's impossible to think about these movements without asking ourselves the question of the role of the state, without asking ourselves the question of democracy. What is democracy when inequality, for instance, is the basis, right? I think these are the types of problems we are dealing with. I know they are huge, and I'm putting here, things that have no solution. But I feel I wouldn't feel comfortable just to think and talk about these movements, or think and talk about death without bringing the issues much deeper to what we are really facing here, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Fernando. Yeah, and I think this is also where the differences show, because in Germany, in the area where I live in a very famous quarter. It's called Kreuzberg. It's the left-wing, former kind of rebellious district in Berlin. And what people tell me, they say, well, is this really real? Do you know anybody who caught it? Do you know anybody who died? So there is this is I think, and this is where the experiences are really different, and they react in different political replies. People suddenly see a system of public health measurements installed that takes away their freedom to move and to wear free face and so on. But the reality that this is equipped to is only in the news and not in the direct surrounding. And this is also why many people suddenly say, well, I'm not doing it anymore. You know, it's all rubbish. It's all fake. It starts the moment you see the suffering in your direct surrounding. When you have it at your door front, then probably behavior will change. But this is I think a situation in Germany that we can experience in different parts. But I would also like to say something to the death rituals. One of the things I found very interesting was the discussion about Dominic Cummings in Britain. He is the advisor of Boris Johnson. He was infected with COVID-19. And despite a complete lockdown, he took his car and his wife and his kid, and he went to see his parents somewhere, whatever, 200, 300 miles away. And the public went mad about this. Now, people are now going to court to get him to court. And there are people who say, and this is what I find really interesting. They said, well, I wasn't able to see my parents and they died and I couldn't say goodbye to him because I didn't break the lockdown. I stick to the rules. Now, Dominic Cummings says, for me, this doesn't count. So all the injustice in terms of economy, people earning a lot, having huge mansions, taking away the tax money, people can live with it. They don't care, they live on their lives and let it be. This is the inequality. But this inequality, where it comes to dealing, with the parents, suddenly makes people who were apolitical, political. And it shows how important these death rituals or also the ask for solidarity from politicians and common people in the English terminology alike is seen. So this is something I found really interesting. Okay, so there are more questions now coming. I'll read it out and then the group, whoever wants, can answer. Anthony Obute says, observing the borderless mobility of the virus across territories and class divides, could we begin to rethink the future of global borders?
I can answer. Yeah.
Okay, I'll maybe Sunita first and then Dilip and then, yeah?
Yeah, I think it's important to see how though virus travel across borders, but then virus has really hardened the borders across nations and across states also. So within India, now if we see while they were the migrants are traveling, even today, if we have to travel, we can't cross the borders of the state. I mean, there's so much of fear, there's so much of uncertainty about who is carrying the virus and where they are going to spread. So even when the migrants were returning back home to the villages, they were asked not to enter the village. And now, as I said, the border, it's borderless for virus, but then we as state borders which have been hardened and completely blocked. I mean, you can't travel across. It's been 3 months, 4 months, even now, we can say that it's very difficult. And one point I wanted to raise on one question related to journalism, where they say traditional journalism, and I suppose the new digital media and the social media which we are in, hundreds of, every second you have hundreds of news channels, Facebook, Twitter and whatnot. I mean, you can see we are bombarded with the information and it's called infodemics. And of course, how much is true, how much is fake, how much is like, it's very difficult. The more you listen to it, the more you get disturbed. So I suppose today's world is full of this visual media, which is like striking us at every second. And it makes a lot of difference. I think the whole pandemic and this whole situation, unlike the previous pandemics in the history, where the social media was not there, was confined. Probably that would have been a better scenario, given that this kind of media now actually gets the fear across each and every individual. If that was not the case, maybe the local, wherever the virus is, wherever the pandemic is, would have been maybe controlled. I'm not really sure on that, but then maybe it would have been a completely different scenario, not being part of the social media all the time.
Thank you, Sunita.
No, I agree with Sunita that certainly it's not about viruses travel across borders because there's nobody to stop them, right? But viruses travel in bodies, unlike bacteria. Viruses need human hosts. But if you think about the way the world is, there is a difference between a black body and a white body, a Christian body and a Muslim body, a Brahmin body and a Dalit body, and so on and so forth. So I don't think the question of borders will go away, because what this has done, what the COVID-19 has done, is to exacerbate anxieties of race and of embodied race. So Chinese are attacked. In the US, the Muslims are seen as vectors of disease. Gay people are seen as vectors of disease in Uganda, and so on and so forth. But to think about another question which is related to this is also the fact of who dies and which body carries the virus. When you think about the end, when we always think about, there's that wonderfully optimistic bell curve, right? There's a disease starts, it rises to a crescendo, and then it declines, and then it's over. And we have the idea of patient zero. but no disease ends. Smallpox is the only human disease that has been completely eliminated. We still have polio with us, we still have AIDS with us, we still have tuberculosis with us. And similarly with COVID-19, this will persist. What will happen is that it will get localized, right? And once it gets localized to a part of the globe that is not the US and not Europe, then it will exit the public imagination. So long as it is in Europe and Italians are dying, French are dying, Americans are dying, I think there is a greater urgency given the general structure of the world, which goes back to the question of bodies and viruses. So I think we need to be thinking much more seriously about this question as the virus is operating in a world that is inflected by inequality, hierarchy, racism, and so on. And that's exactly the way it will work. It will exacerbate all of those tendencies. And so what would have happened if this had been an illness that had been only a Chinese illness, right? It happened in Wuhan and had stayed in Wuhan. Would it have been considered globally important? Right? These are questions that we still need to ask, given the inequalities. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Fernando, would you like to say something?
Yes. I think Sunita and Dilip have already said, I mean, the fact of this borderless mobility of the virus, in fact, has activated the borders. That's the point. I think we are dealing with a massacre. That's the point I think we have to stick to. I mean, it's a pity, it's sad, but it's a fact, right? I mean, this has activated the whole issue that we already knew. Borders have always been a problem of bodies. Always. Always there is the issue of who can cross, who cannot, who is allowed to go, who is not, right? What is new about this thing now? Okay, perhaps there is something new. I myself as a Brazilian cannot go to Europe this month. I'm not allowed to cross the border. Okay, this is new for me, right? One who is privileged of being white, one who is privileged of being a professor, one who is, okay, but this is nothing related to the whole thing that we are dealing with all the time, right? So again, thinking with, from your question, Anthony, I think borders have always been an issue of bodies. I don't think this is something new. What we're facing now, it's something that is even more urgent than before, perhaps. And about media, as Sunita mentioned the question, I would just add also, as I come from this field of media studies, what we're seeing nowadays with the social media. I'm not going to talk about all these the problem of a certain excess of things that are coming out every day, which sometimes make us confused about the whole situation, right? But then there is the other side of allowing us to be perhaps more aware of all these complexities that we have been dealing with. So somehow, many times, the social media helps us fight these problems by allowing us to be more perhaps aware, I wouldn't say conscious, but aware of the whole situation we're living. And there is something interesting also that is happening in the social media that I'm following here, which is they are working very much on building histories or building stories of people who have died. And they are doing this saying exactly that they are working against the traditional media who only works on numbers, on figures, on counting people who died, right? So there is a certain counteraction coming from certain social media resources that are emphasizing the necessity of working on stories of humane stories. This is also something interesting. Again, not new, right? This comes out many times during catastrophes. This is not something new. I think we have to be aware of this, but this is something important that is going on nowadays too.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. The kind of the abstract numbers who are somewhere out there and the concrete suffering of people say out their names. This is what it is. This is what we find in different situations at the moment now. And what does it do to our imagination, because at the end it's in our head, as Sunita said, or as we saw 100 years ago with the Spanish flu. It was there, it was ravaging the world. But without social media, people weren't aware about the dimensions globally. That only came out later after medical historians or medical staff kind of put the pictures together. And there's this wonderful book of Pale Rider about the Spanish flu, which I think is now being sold a lot because it makes us learn about what's going on. And what we see here is these global connections, how they are happening, how intense they are, and how they are suddenly break down, and everybody goes back to their villages in India, to their home countries, to their social groups where they have support. So this is also where do people belong in different ways, for their own in their own imagination or in their own belonging, or by the states, by the agencies who deal with them and who send them out. So this is also something to look at. But at the moment, I have to look at the time because we are already 6 o'clock, and I'll just want. I don't want to not look at anybody. So we had the question of Roberto, we had the one of Anthony, of Louis, of Natalia on journalism. Davida Atiampong was saying, I would like to ask the panelists if it is time for the world to rethink democracy, and also if capitalism has failed the world, looking at the serious societal issues this virus has unveiled. And I'll read the other question also, and then maybe we have a short finalizing words. Julian Eugenio is asking, in Brazil, we have been witnessing the exponential increasing of infection and death by coronavirus in indigenous and other traditional communities due to invasions and illegal economic activities in their territories. At the same time, we have seen political mobilizations by those same people on the internet in order to speak out about these issues. I would be glad if the panelists could comment on how the pandemic is affecting autochthonous peoples in their respective countries. Thank you. So I would be grateful if you could say a few words to this, and also have a finalizing word, closing words for yourself. And I think I just go the order we had. So we start with Sunita.
I would like to just point on the last question about indigenous population within India. We really don't have much idea, given that the borders are closed, hardly any research being done. And there are some community-based organizations which are highlighting the problems and challenges faced by rural India, but not really on the tribes, which I'm not really sure about it. But my closing remarks would be that we are still facing this pandemic. In India, the count is going up. I suppose we are now third in ranking all over the world. So while we are unlocking, we are seeing majority of the cases increasing. So I suppose then there are a few states who are going back to lockdown, and lockdown has actually led to a lot of problems within the economy and for individuals and families as such. It had huge impact on the families. So thereby, again, we have some time to rethink on the kind of world we want to live in, given the changes which we have seen, given the 4 months period where things have changed. It's very important for the national authorities to look into the issues related to jobs, because before pandemics also the unemployment rates had gone up, and now it has gone too many of them have been laid down to leave the jobs and cut in the salaries. But down the line, I suppose, unless this maybe disasters are also seen as an opportunities. Now, unless we take a very conscious effort to rethink about the inequalities in society, look at the caste, class, and gender lines, and rework on the policies and programs and redistribution of resources. Otherwise, we are going to follow the same path, go with the same kind of disparities we have seen for centuries, and it's going to aggravate much more. So possibly it's very important for the leadership, for the academia and everybody to highlight, and it's being highlighted, And today also what we have learned from Professor Dilip and Fernando, that across the world, the inequalities are becoming even more stark. Thanks to pandemics, which has shown us the inequalities which are so real and stark, and much more because of pandemics. So possibly this is the time to rethink and rework on the whole system and restructure the societies. This is very, I say, optimistic view, and it all depends on the political leadership. And as we are seeing, things are changing drastically. Only hoping for the best and whatever we can do at our individual levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunita. Thank you. Dilip?
So two things. One, to continue with that observation that look, epidemics, illnesses never really end, diseases never really end, they just relocate. And how do we continue to think about an ongoing crisis, that this is not going to end in 6 months, 1 year, and so on. But to get to the question that David Akyampong raised about capitalism and democracy, one of the great things about lockdown is that you can read the books that you've always wanted to read. So Capital and Ideology, Piketty, I'm reading it right now. I'm on page 560, only 440 more pages to go. But the important thing that Piketty is saying in this is that at various points when transformations have happened, when inequalities have increased to a height, as happened in the Belle Epoque, the period just before the war, the period of the French Revolution, and right now, what you have is an ideological shift that happens at the same time. So along with the social and political and economic crisis, there's an ideological shift that happens. And I think that will happen because the COVID-19 crisis came in the middle of increasing discussions about the rates of inequality, which are unparalleled in human history. And I think, hopefully, and this is my sense of optimism, that there will be an ideological shift which will help us to reflect on how capitalism undergirds the inequality, the capitalist system undergirds the inequality of the world, and that democracy as it is constituted right now, neoliberal democracy, has no means of handling that inequality, which takes us back to questions of the new role that the people and state will play in terms of social redistribution and of putting pressures towards creation of a new system. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dilip. Fernando?
Well, about the question about indigenous people, I'm afraid I cannot, be more precise, saying because the question is very objective, right? I mean, how it's been affected, these people. As long as I know, I mean, these people in Brazil, they're dying more and more, right? The tribes and the Indians, we have had reports of what's going on in the Amazon and in distant places in Brazil. And it seems to me that this is, again, the part of this necropolitical state we've been going through and living with, right? So it's a whole bunch of problems that we already know of, that they come again for us once again, so that perhaps we can reevaluate them and see how it can be dealt with. One thing that I think it's important for us to think, at least this is what it's been, striking me a lot. It's this idea of democracy and capitalism. I mean, the moment we have now, not only to rethink, but to try to produce other possibilities of understanding these phenomena. At least this idea of democracy. It's very clear for us that what we thought and what we understood about democracy is really not democracy at all in the case of Brazil. Right. So if Acosta, that talks about the bem viver, he puts the question of capitalism in the center of his critique, I think this is, as we are talking about well-being here, right? I mean, the whole forum is about this. I think this is something that we should be concerned about when we're talking about not only global South, but when we're talking about the world. Perhaps this is what we should move forward in this forum. I think that's my impression. That's the impression I have. Because inequality, as I tried to say before, I think it's the pandemia we will be left with. This is a world. This is a problem of the world. I'm not talking about a problem of Brazil only. I'm not talking about a problem of Africa, any country in Africa. So I think we now have perhaps to think about this in a global scale. I know that many people have already been thinking about that. We have high numbers of inequality in global scale, but in terms of thinking of the virus and inequality, perhaps the virus, we will find a vaccine for that. Perhaps in, I don't know how long, in 1 year or so, right? But inequality is here perhaps to stay longer. And this is a problem we will be dealing with in a global scale, I think. Just hope that this gives us a chance to think and to do. I wish, Dilip, I had more time to read everything I wanted to. It's impossible because we also don't have the time is like, running fast at the same time, isn't it? But that's it. I'm sorry, I have nothing.
Now is the time. Once the virus is over, you will stop reading.
That's the point. But my problem is if I am now reading with the virus going on, because there's so many things to do at the same time. But I understand what you mean. Yes, it's a chance we all have to stop and think also, right? Yeah. Thank you. I want to thank everybody there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Dilip. Thank you, Sunita. I think the acceleration of inequality is a very big topic. And it happens everywhere, but in very different ways. And this is probably something to understand or to go for more comparative research at some point. The idea of solidarity, of being broken down to a body who is dependent on other bodies, no matter how rich or how poor you are, is also something that I think we need to consider, because it brings our bodiness to the forefront. Even though our bodies are different, as Dilip said, they are white or black, they are Brahmanical, they are Dalit. They're healthy, they're young, they're old, they're vulnerable, but I think in many ways it seems like the awareness of the catastrophe being there and not being far away, as it is when talking about global warming, is something that has changed the general approach to health, to death, to healing, as well as to the state and to inequality. Thank you all. We will talk about this more. Thanks to the audience a lot for staying with us and to listening to us. And I hope to see you at other seminars coming up this week at the Roundtable, for example, as well. And thank you to all the panelists and to Robert and to Sebastian. And we'll close here.
Okay, thank you all, people.
Thank you.
Thanks also from my part, and for all attendees, there is a small evaluation when you leave this session. You will be asked to take part in a short evaluation, and we just kindly ask you to give us some feedback, so we're also able to improve for the upcoming sessions in this forum. Thanks to all.
Small evaluation. I thought you were going to give us marks for our presentation.
Hmm?
How much did I get?
I will tell you, yeah.
100%.
Yeah, so thanks to all of you. It was a great opening of this forum and looking forward to the upcoming sessions.
Thank you.
Stay, all of you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.